is the Integral Stage Meta Podcast, where we podcast meta-level podcasters, interview integral interviewers, and make critical comments with second-tier critical commentators. Who are these inspired malcontents who seem unable to stop themselves from engaging higher ideas and more inclusive visions through internet media? And how can we help them clarify, amplify, and unify their projects? What do they collectively tell us about the nature and future of emerging integrative philosophies and communities? Here to help me think through all this today is a free will theorist and critic of Integral 1.0, whose name I think might be pronounced Aljoša Kutnjak, though maybe it's Aljoša Kutnjak or maybe Aljoša Kutnjak. Let's find out.
Well, I mean, different people pronounce it differently, but usually they just say Aljoša.
Aljoša?
Yeah, Aljoša Kutnjak. Some people say Kutnjak. Some people in Integral Global have some funny nickname. Whatever. Yeah, it's different names, but I just Aljoša is fine.
All right, terrific. And let's start by, why don't you tell people where they can find some stuff you've done, and also why did you do that stuff?
Well, I mean, let's just go how I came to the Integral Global. I guess I'm gonna stay a little background.
Sure.
So I was studying Integral around, let's say, 10 years ago, and then I don't know when I came to the Integral Global website, which is usually where the main people from Integral who are interested in Integral come, and then I studied philosophy, sociology, many other things, not officially, but just like a bookwormish guy outside the academia, just like David Long. And then at some point I watched some David Long's video, and I, for whatever reason, felt like he was closer to why I feel is true, and that's how we connected. And then we started the Integral 2.0 and all that other stuff. But mostly you can find me at this point, my main English YouTube channel. I just have around 10 videos at the moment, but I'll have a lot more. Try to do like 2-3 videos a week, because the way I do it is really fast, because there's not a lot of editing compared to David, who likes to do very slow and edited stuff. Yeah, but for me, it's not just about Integral per se. It's more progressivism combined with Integral. And I'm more into politics. David is not. David cares more about education, but I also care about politics as well. So we have a little differentiated view, but still, I mean, we pretty much are on the same page regarding the metaphysics and stuff. But yeah, if somebody wants to find me, obviously find my YouTube channel, which you can, I guess, link or something. And you have more my social media under my YouTube channel as well. So, and I'm also writing a book, but when it comes out, I'll of course tell people. And the book talks about the free will and some other things, and we're probably gonna get some into it today either way. So.
Sure, yeah. I'd like to talk about progressive politics and also about the metaphysics and free will.
And we're also talking while we have one of the wackiest elections
it's happening right now.
Yeah, and it went one way the yesterday, and now it's turning. It's just crazy in America. You're from Canada, if I saw correctly? Yeah.
Close enough that we feel like Americans, but far enough away that we don't have to suffer every bad thing that they do to themselves.
No, there are some Canadian memes where like Canadians with popcorn watching the U.S. election. You had some pictures.
Yeah, the basic Canadian spirit is really ill-defined. What we mostly have is this feeling that we're better than Americans.
Well, I mean, it's, from these estimates, you seem like you are, because Biden is just narrowly gonna probably win this, but it's gonna be quite a show. Let's put it that way.
What do you love the most about online integral communities, and what frustrates you the most about those communities?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, you probably noticed there's quite a split between what, let's say, David do and what Integral does in general. Obviously, I'm gonna take my take. This is just my perspective. I think that the problem, and this is also a take that I think to some extent, I forgot their both names, but you host a conversation between some anarcho-capitalist and a socialist. I think some
Brent and Brian.
Someone started with the name B.
Yep, or Brian Doherty and
yeah. And the other one was who?
Brent.
Yeah, he was a socialist one.
Yeah.
And I do think that one of the problems that Brent mentions, because I watched the whole thing, is that he seemed like he came kind of, obviously he has a lot of videos I didn't watch, but he seemed to be a bit disillusioned with integral, because the problem is the way integral as a language, it's its own language. In a way, you can basically use the language without going into details and just prescribe something without any kind of rational reason. So for instance, if I stand by something and integral global, for instance, disagrees, they can just say, oh, you're just orange green. And once you try to pin them down to why do you think that's the case, they will not engage in any further debate. So the problem is that integral can be used for a very good labeling of people, but that labeling is also a problem because it doesn't go into a deeper issue as to why, right? Because if I just dismiss somebody, and this is one of the problems, obviously, is that the language game that integral plays, it can be very deep, but it also seems to be very shallow once you see the chats in integral global as an example, right? And that's one of my first problems. And then the second problem that I had when I was kind of disillusioned with integral global and Ken Wilber is also when I did a critical video about the neoliberal soulcraft, which basically means that you use integral theory for kind of like neoliberal capitalistic orange self-help kind of a way. Because if you look at the products in integral life, for instance, this is not a philosophy anymore. It's more like, oh, you're going to be integral, you're special, you're the special person. And I feel like this kind of plays into the dogma of neoliberal hyper-individualism in terms of everybody needs to feel special, but there's no kind of collective synergy. I think that a lot of people in integral global just want to feel special and not have any kind of collective synergy. So I think that my kind of plan, I think where it should go is not this neoliberal self-help, but a political movement, right? Because we only live in a certain space, in time, right? So at this moment we live in a material I usually use kind of Marxist words, material conditions where you have, let's say, Democrats and Republicans battling with some neoliberal capitalistic framework, right? And now, of course, you can be integral and just say, well, I'm beyond all that, I transcend and include, but this is not going to help. I think integral should probably be on the side of where we want people to be. So we can, of course, criticize, let's say, postmodernism and progressivism and woke and cancel culture. All that is important to criticize. But at the same time, we need to stand by the progressive values that the new left is bringing to the table. So it would be, let's say, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Squad, Bernie Sanders, and so on, because these are the progressive values that are, let's say, the most scientifically informed. And this is where our society would need to strive. And I feel like if integral global should be anything, it should kind of infiltrate those spaces and help people from blue and orange come to green and then yellow. That would be, so I think I see more integral global as a political movement and educational, of course, and not just this neoliberal self-help where they're just selling you products and telling you, oh, you're this special snowflake, now go create another stupid company and sell your self-help products. This is kind of my main criticism of integral global at this moment.
Yeah, that's interesting because I see two ways in which there's a real tendency in the integral community to reinforce neoliberal status quo in terms of socioeconomics and politics. And one of them is, like you're saying, this emphasis on individualism, self-help, and sort of consumer spirituality culture and feeling special. The other one is the tendency to balance all of the positions and say that none of the positions are more advanced than, right? If anybody has a position that seems like they're being too extreme. And so there's a lot of people who feel like if you take, say, a progressive position, you're being imbalanced, and they want to correct that. And this tendency to be super inclusive and super balanced leaves us basically backed into the status quo, right? That the system as it currently exists wants us to balance all of the options equally so that we stay where we are. But if one of those options is actually better than another one at the moment for people to move forward, then we can't just balance things out and include them all equally. We have to favor one over the other in order to get progress.
Yeah, exactly. So the problem that these people have is exactly that they just think that they need to be all inclusive, and this is probably would I guess, argue that this is sort of a green relativism here, even though it's pretending to be integral, but I think it's not. And at some point, I think that somebody who's at the beginning in integral, who just starting to find out, he might feel like, yeah, this is the case. I need to be inclusive. If I hate capitalism, that automatically means that you have orange shadow in integral global community, of course. And I think that at some point, once you kind of digest integral for some years, you actually realize, oh shit, I actually need to pick a stand. Either I'm going to be a materialist. Although I think that the problem with materialism and emergentism that I know that David Long and Matthew T. Siegel had when Bruce was doing the moderating, I think that's actually not the most important debate, in my opinion, because obviously when you're going to have people who are materialist versus emergentist, idealist versus emergentist, is that nobody can really prove each other wrong because nobody knows what the absolute reality is. So Matthew T. Siegel can disprove David Long, and David Long can disprove Matthew T. Siegel. Maybe I'll have a chat with Matthew T. Siegel at some point.
So
but
what's
I said today,
the more important debate to have? What's the more important debate to have?
Yeah, well, exactly. I think that the problem is, does your view, either being idealistic or materialistic, I don't necessarily even care how you view the ultimate reality, but does it correspond with even the material reality we live in? Now, I call it material just because we need a word for it. I'm not necessarily saying things are made out of material. For all I care, they're all made of consciousness. I don't really care at this point. Whatever the ultimate reality is, does your pragmatic language that you use, and I feel that this is where Matthew T. Siegel kind of fails, is because the problem is that you can, what the German idealism usually does, and I'm no expert in German, I almost read Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit, and it's an extremely hard book. It's just gonna pass by. I'm not gonna do any concrete study because it's too much. But what tends to happen with these philosophers is they use their own metaphysical language. And like David said to Siegel, does this metaphysical language cash out? And when I was listening to them talking, Matthew T. Siegel fall apart when the free will debate came up. And then that's why this is where I actually then asked Matthew T. Siegel if you want to continue with that, because I feel this is where Matthew T. Siegel's metaphysics kind of fall apart. Because you can easily defend determinism, and there's no way somebody's gonna come out of it unless he just switches the subject and says, well, it's not important, or whatever the case may be. But I never heard any liberal or compatibilist, and I'm talking about in terms of philosophical view on free will, not liberal in terms of political view, because you have like the three views, liberal, compatibilism, and determinism. And usually people are somewhere between liberal and compatibilist, and you can easily blow out both of them. There's no chance they're gonna stand. And I feel this is where, people who come from idealistic ground fail. So for me, the problem is not so much whether world is ultimately some huge consciousness that goes all the way down, holistically speaking, or it's all a material, pure material energy, whatever you want to call it. Either way, the question is, does it cash out with reality as we know it? So I have nothing against Matthew T. Siegel if his metaphysics also work in pragmatical reality terms. If we can build a microprocessor with his metaphysics, I'm fine with that, because his metaphysics and the language he uses works, and we can build, as an example, a processor, right? But if it doesn't, and in the question of free will, it obviously showed that this is where Matthew basically falls apart, then his language game doesn't cash out, and he's basically wrong. And I think somebody should probably fix that mistake. That's now maybe you do believe in free will, and maybe we can kind of get in that if you want, but I feel this is where I feel this is debate it should be, not materialism versus idealism, but free will versus determinism, because this is usually where all idealists fall apart.
You think this is at the core of what Integral 2.0 is interested in, like a closer mapping between our philosophical and language patterns and material reality?
Yeah, I think this is, obviously you have the tenets that David Long talked about. But this is sort of the way we see it. And we actually make some very important distinctions that a lot of people in the integral global can seem to understand. Something that David talked about, called the semantic incompatibilism, which means, although the problem with David, I think, is he phrased it wrong. I think David makes a mistake when he says he's a semantic incompatibilist, because he can't be, because first and second person language game is not compatible with third-person reality. So by definition, he is a semantic incompatibilist, because you can't. Now I understand why he says he's a compatibilist, but he cannot be by definition. So we need to understand that the first and second person language that you use. So stereotypical example would be if I say I'm going to the store, right? Well, who's I in this case? Now, I is obviously a social construct that you are made of, that we are all made of. So we can be, usually when we say I, we usually mean like there's a hamster or some spirit behind our brain kind of steering the wheel. And this is like his, headlights looking, and you are like this free person steering the lights wherever you want to go, right? Steering your focus. This is the idea. But this is actually false once you take a look at it from objective reality, right? Because this is something that Sam Harris pointed out, and he realized within his meditation is if you actually pay attention to this moment, you don't actually know what your next thought or feeling or intention is going to be, right? So even when we're talking right now, I don't know what I'm going to say next. You don't know what you're going to say back to me until that thought or feeling arises in your stream of consciousness. So this is where Sam argues brilliantly. How are you free to say whatever you want to say when you don't know what you're going to say until you say it yourself? So when we talk, let's say when you and I talk, we are just as surprised what we're going to say next as anybody else would be, because we don't know either. You don't know what you're going to think or say next. I don't know what I'm going to think or say next. And it's all just happening at this moment. And for whatever reason, idealists actually think there's like a hidden soul behind the brain, whatever it may be, that's actually freely expressing itself and steering in some ultimate absolute reality, whatever your metaphysics is. It's bizarre. And this is where I feel most idealists quickly fall apart. This is my kind of interpretation. So semantic incompatibilism basically states that when I say I'm going to the store, although that's true within the metaphysics of first and second person language, because we use the idea of I as an ego, as a social construct, so it's easier to communicate from a pragmatic perspective. But it has nothing to do with actual objective reality. Objective. If I wanted to say I'm going to the store in objective terms, I would have to say that all the things from the Big Bang to this moment, where for whatever reason, an impulse that I want to go to the store arise in my consciousness, and for whatever reason, all the cells in this body, all the holons went to the store. That would be and there's no freedom here, right? So people don't understand this very basic problem that I think even Wittgenstein talked about it. I think Hume talked about it. So it's kind of interesting that people can't comprehend such a basic problem.
When you think about that, when you think about the fact that me going to the store is actually the entire universe from the Big Bang going to the store, how does that feel to you? Does that seem like that's part of your spirituality? Does it have what's the flavor of that? Why would that be meaningful to people? Why is it meaningful to you?
Well, I mean, the problem is that whatever interpretation I'm going to have is already determined. So there's no free will. Whatever I'm going to say, there's no freedom in there either. So this is kind of whatever I'm going to say right now, there's no freedom. Now, obviously, people usually go to the pragmatic case that even if I'm right, or even if Sam Harris or David Long, whoever, it doesn't matter. Even if you're right, how useful can such a thing be, right? What can help you if you think you're nothing but a determined like cause or whatever? But ironically, it can bring you a lot of freedom in sense that you don't take yourself so seriously. Because usually I kind of strike back with this. Let's say you have somebody who had bad childhood. Let's say he became drug addict and he can't help himself. But then let's say he's a kid, and when he becomes 18 or 21, whatever is the adult age in Canada or US, we come to him and say, you know what? Even though till the adult age, 18, 21, whatever it might be, you were, like, say, the state could take care of your parents. Now you are this free-willed creature, and now everything from that point on is your fault. Now you have somebody whose psyche is totally destroyed, who can't help himself but to become a drug addict, something that happens usually to a lot of homeless people in the Invisible People channel on YouTube. If somebody doesn't know, can check it out. What's going to make him more damage in this case? Because if I say to a man, hey, you have free will, now you're responsible, he's not going to be able to be. So what's going to happen is he's going to go into a loop. If I'm free, but I can't help myself, he's going to become even more depressed. So both ways can be dangerous. Now, obviously, I'm not saying we should go to all the drug addicts and say, well, you have no freedom. You are determined to die of overdose. This is not the case. But we should also be aware that there's a semantic, pragmatic difference between what is helpful within an individual context. So for instance, if you are a drug addict, I wouldn't say you have no free will, so you're going to kill yourself. I'm going to say, you got to find help. It's in you. You can do it. I trust you, whatever. Try to help you, right? But when it comes to systemic issues, and this is the important part, it's one thing to help you in individual level using freedom, right? But it's totally another if I say all homeless people are actually, it's their fault because they didn't use their free will right, because this is how neoliberalism works, right? The reason you're homeless in America is not because there are any systemic racism or, all the rich people have more and more money, so economical deprivation and so on. It's you because you didn't use your free will right. So where the danger is, if somebody uses this first and second person truths as if pretending that people are free and puts them in systemic issues, then you have a huge problem. And this is why you have so many homeless people in America, because Americans literally believe, because they can't understand that semantic incompatibilism, that first and second person is just a language game that's useful within the pragmatic level, but has nothing to do with systemic objective reality. So what was your question again?
Yeah, at this point. It's a very interesting question, free will. It seems obvious to me that we exist in a universe where the patterns are so complex, even the patterns, like you say, of what we're speaking, but also the patterns of the breeze and the trees and the fish, they're all so complex that we can't get ahead of them. We can't guess what's going to happen next. So in a way, everything has free will in the sense that we can't predict it. And at the same time, individuals, whatever we mean by an individual, can exhibit seemingly more or less freedom in their ability to actualize their intentions. And it seems like those two things are true whether or not the universe is totally deterministic or totally indeterministic. It still looks the same. So it's hard to tell which way to lean on that. And like you were saying, if you lean too much on the free will side, you end up blaming people for things that were not their fault. If you lean too much on the no free will side, you end up sabotaging their feeling that they can make a change.
Yeah, but here's my argument. So let's say, so this comes back to the problem of systems, right? Do you think that even if it's the case that let's say President Trump or whoever is the winner comes up and say, hey, you know what, we determined there's no free will. It's not like all the people, because I think one thing that I find it kind of interesting, because this is something that Matthew T. Siegel was afraid. Well, if we just say there's no free will, everything's going to fall into chaos and nihilism, which is utterly ridiculous, right? You can still use your own first and second person language and pretend that you're free, or I or anybody, without ever mistaking the fact that everything is determined. So there is a compatibilism here in terms of using the first and second language and pretending you're free, even though it's objectively true to say you're not. So when we help each other on pragmatic level, so let's say if I'm a drug addict, obviously you're not going to say you have no free will, fuck you. You're going to say, try to be, try to become a better person, clean your room, whatever the case may be. But you will also understand, okay, but on systemic level and objective level, we know it's not that he's going to be determined to do what he's going to be determined to do. So what you can do is change the system in which there's not going to be a situation where people become a drug addicts in the first place, or homeless, or whatever the case may be, right? So it's got to be so. And this idea that both things are true, of course, is again false, because just observing your train of thought, you're basically, the argument here is if somebody doesn't think he's free, he's just gonna become a bad person. But again, this all comes down to how he grew up and what kind of systems he grew up, or maybe if he has kind of a genetic problems. But in general, the idea is that if you say to people, well, you don't have free will, so everybody is gonna become nihilistic and chaotic, it's just bizarre. Because if you have good childhood, whether you think free will does exist or not, you're still going to be a good person because you have no choice. Like Christopher Hitchens said, there's no choice but to think we have free will, even though it's like we are determined to think we have it on a pragmatic level, but it's actually true to say we don't. So we need to understand that these are incompatible language games, which is something that people can't seem to understand. When it comes to systemic level or objective reality, it's a fact that there's no freedom, period. End of the debate. But we can use the first and second person language to help people on pragmatic individual levels, but we use the systemic objective truths when it comes to how do we measure our society, right? And the problem with the Republicans, just as an example, all people or idealists in general, is that they still want to save that freedom some way, somehow, when there is none. And this is where their metaphysics falls apart. And we know that there's no freedom because just look at what people are doing with rats. You can literally have USB rat remote controlled with neurostimuli chips that you put in the rat's brain, and you can control them. And Neuralink that Elon Musk is doing, in the future, it's totally possible that you are gonna chip you in. And if you, let's say you're an atheist right now, we can put a chip in you and say, well, guess what? You're a Christian now, and your stream of consciousness will become Christian. Now that's possible, and if we know that's possible in theory, the space for free will automatically disappears. Because most people think that if I give you a chip in your brain, let's say you're an atheist, and let's say a chip is for Christian person, people think, oh, then your soul is gonna defend against that chip, right? Your soul freedom will, no, it's not. The content of your consciousness will become Christian, and you're gonna become Christian, and there's no freedom involved. Even if you think you're free, chip is gonna make you think you're free. And obviously, with all the other neurological studies, for instance, there was a famous case. There was a guy who had tumor in the front of his lobe, and for whatever reason, when he started to have a tumor, pedophilic instincts came up, and he was, for whatever reason, interested in pedophilia. And when they found on the computer some pornographic images of pedophilia, he was sent to the court, and he complained about headaches and so on. They then put a test, and they realized he had tumor in front of the whatever part of the brain, which would explain why these pedophilic instincts could come up. And then they removed the tumor, and the pedophilic tendencies also removed. And then they came back, and the pedophilic instincts also came back, and they did remove it again, and it disappeared. So we know that changes in the brain chemistry can totally influence somebody what they want, and obviously nobody can choose what they want. And there's no shadow of a doubt, there's no such case for any kind of freedom whatsoever. We know that from 150 years of neurology, or let's say these 70 years, we know that thought, the electric signal from the thought is created faster before it comes into your stream of consciousness. I just don't see any way beyond saying, well, even if all that is true, I don't care. Pragmatically, it's still better to think that I'm free. And I think we need to really draw the line to say, sure, you can think that, but but just understand this is a language game that has nothing to do with objective reality. And this is where the semantic incompatibilism comes in, to people understand these language games.
The integral model is like the different quadrants represent different kinds of causality. Yeah. Right? You can have a causality in the first person where you're describing yourself as causal, but if you look at the systems quadrant, then the systems are the cause. If you look at the material quadrant, then the substances are the cause.
Yeah.
It's intriguing to think of the free will is leaning more towards the two left-hand quadrants, and determinism is leaning more towards the right-hand quadrants. That's
yeah.
When you look at the outside of things, then there's no free will.
I mean,
what's your feeling? Is your feeling that the third person is more real than the other two, or that those games are equally real but distinct?
It depends. Again, it's the problem is the language game. But so we need to understand if you don't know what your next thought is going to be, how can you author that thought if you don't know what's going to be? So you don't know what you're going to say next at this moment, right? You're looking at your brain, whatever you might see, stream of consciousness is coming, and even when you're going to reply to me, you don't know what you're going to say until this reply comes in your consciousness. So where is the freedom for you to choose what you're going to reply if you don't know what you're going to reply until that reply comes into your stream of consciousness? So what I'm doing here is making an objective claim about your and I and everybody's subjectivity, right? So that would be kind of my answer. So let's see how.
What would you say to the argument that authorship is something that's freely added on to the process after the fact? Like Nietzsche said, to love your fate is to say of every it was that I willed it thus, right?
Yeah.
Saying like it's not necessarily what I wanted to have happen, but when I incorporate everything in a way where I feel like I decided, I'm actually in a better position. I'm succeeding in organizing my perception of reality when I feel that way. And when I don't feel that way, I'm not succeeding in incorporating all the elements of my reality. So, but there's a free will added after the fact, right? So that authorship is a plus one rather than a retroactive assumption.
Well, I mean, the problem is that all these things that you said are determined. Even if you let's say this is the case, right? Even if that's the case, and you feel free, you didn't choose to feel free, right? But here's the problem. Again, this is like missing the problem with subjective and objective language, because this is the problem. You're using conceptual understanding yourself as a person versus the nature of this moment, and the nature of this moment is. You don't know. There are two things. There's something that Cosmic Skeptic, I did a video on it, said very well. There are only two forces controlling you in your life. Either you are forced to do something or you want to do something. So let's see which one you control. Obviously, you don't control what you're forced to do. If I point a gun on your head and say you need to do this or I'll kill you, obviously you're going to have to do it. So you have no control in being coerced or forced into doing something. But now here's the kicker. You also don't choose what you want either, right? So if we know that the tumor that person had, and you can look at the study and can link it to you, influences that he's going to look at pedophilia. It's that influences what he wants and then goes for it because this is what he wants, right? So again, he had no freedom to do otherwise until tumor was removed. So now you could, of course, go to that person and say, well, you can still control it, but he's not going to be able to, because he cannot control what he wants and therefore does. So how would you, you're basically saying that even if he has a tumor, I can convince him not to do it. And I'm saying, no, you can't. So would you be able to convince him to not to do it?
Certainly not, because they all have to work together somehow is the interesting thing. I think this is what the conservative mentality often misses, right? Like the person who says, look, you're failing in life because you haven't made the right decisions. You don't have the right values. You're not making the right choices. But if you press them on that, how is a person going to get the right choices and the right values? Then a system has to put those in, right? So, well, your church or your family or something like that has to add those to you, right? So I think if you examine anybody's perspective who believes in free will, ultimately they have to believe in certain objective realities that enable what they're calling free will to flourish in an individual.
Yeah. I mean, that's a pragmatic concept that's obviously working. Again, I have nothing against the concept of free will. I'm just saying that so for me, I don't really care if somebody sees themselves as free or not. But what I do care is if they use that same concept then to justify homeless people or drug addicts and so on. Because the problem I see is if somebody believes in free will and he's fine in life, that's fine. But the problem is if he thinks that his freedom, the problem I see is if people believe in free will, they become extremely egocentric. And this is happening in America right now, right? Because now they feel the reason they succeeded was their own doing. And this blinds us to the systemic problems of systemic racism, homelessness, drug addicts, opioid crisis, and so on. Because obviously, all those people are quote unquote free as well, right? Why don't they just stop using drugs and get a job or something, right? So the reason I feel this free will concept is super dangerous, if not understanding proper context, is exactly because it blinds us to the fact that those people were just unlucky, period. Right? They didn't pick their genes, they didn't pick their environment, abusive household, whatever the case may be that brought them to being homeless or drug addicts. And I think that this is why I feel like it corrupts people, because they don't see that the homeless person really just was unlucky. And not only they don't see that, they don't see how lucky they fucking were This is another problem, right? So this is what happens usually to self-help gurus who actually think that the reason they're succeeded is because they just use the free will the right way, and now they're teaching other people how to do it. And this is to some extent what Integral Global is promising. We're going to teach you how to use free will, so you're going to become this successful capitalist. And again, my main concern is not so much if we agree whether we have free will or not. It's just that it can delude us from actually dealing with systemic issues. So let me ask you then, how do you see this solution? So let's say free will does exist, or let's say we pretend it does. Although I don't think so, but let's say it does. How do you then convince somebody who literally believes in free will, let's say some Republican, and how do you convince him? Because I assume you also want to help homeless and you think there should be some economic things to help people flourish, right? Not just say, fuck you, use your free will the right way, right? So how do you, in your personal life, let's say if you believe in free will, how do you navigate these systemic issues versus these personal issues? How do we have personal? How do you navigate those waters?
It's very tricky, because I think in one way what you're saying is we have to be much more careful about the boundaries between the quadrants, right? So each of them, there's a plausibility to each of those language games, but the problem comes when one of them presses into one of the other zones, right?
Yeah.
So there's a conversation we can have with people about free will that may be able to help them exercise a greater degree of like self-hacking relative to their own lifestyle. And that's very useful. But as soon as that's strays into the systemic domain and replaces our systemic analysis, then we've got a problem. Or as soon as it strays into the material domain, right? As soon as we blame their free choice for something that was actually the result of a vitamin deficiency, or actually the result of the economic system, then we have a problem. So we need to sort of police. This is one of the things I see Integral 2.0 doing, is trying to police the boundaries between the quadrants a little more cleanly. But I do think people have, relatively speaking, right? If subjective free will is always a relative phenomenon and not an objective absolute phenomenon, we should be very interested in the things that enable that relative degree of free will to increase in people. But we absolutely shouldn't use that as an excuse to sabotage the causality that's coming from the other domains.
Yeah, I mean, I agree on this point. I just don't see how that can happen. That's why I feel like if you undercut the main problem, we can kind of save. And the problem is that the concept of free will, even though I guess it could be useful, I haven't given a lot of thought. What do you say? I mean, at what point somebody can realize there's no free will, and in what one should realize there's no free will, just like one should realize there's no Santa Claus, right? At one point, should we say to a child there's no Santa Claus? Well, there's no like objective answer. But so again, using free will as a concept, I think obviously can be useful and can empower people to make more free decisions. But it can also not be. Again, there's no right answer. And this is the problem, that our language is extremely limited, right? And because our first and second person language is not compatible with third person language, there's a lot of confusion that people have. And that's why I feel that we need to first make people understand. And I don't know at what level that might be on spiral dynamics, but I feel that a lot of systemic issues could be solved if we throw this free will out of the window, because we know from neuroscience there's no free will. Now, obviously, we can use it in a conceptual relative term, but that doesn't switch the fact that there's no free will. This is just determine your conceptual freedom will to some extent determine, because obviously it's hard to say what are all the things that determine us. The world is way too complex. But there's something that, you know, when we did a review on Ken Wilber and Corey DeVos with David Long, and this is the problem. How would you say when Wilber literally said that he doesn't care what's happening in the upper right quadrant? He doesn't give a shit. He only cares what's happening on the upper left. Something like that. Literal quote. You can go check it out. And it's how do you deal? We know that changing the upper right, changing the objective reality, correlates to changing the subjective brain states. Right? If you spike a part of the brain, something's gonna happen. And you like I said with the pedophile instinct, and you have many of those cases. For instance, when you have split brain patients, another big one that nobody in Integral doesn't want to talk about because that would mean they're splitting their soul in half. What happens is in the 1950s, so let's talk about neurology a bit, because I don't think people in interglobal didn't do any study on it. So I'm just gonna very oversimplify the evolution of neurology. So there are like three basic ways people usually understand the problem of freedom. Let's say in the first stage, you just think God gave you free will and you are free, period. Usually how one would argue Republicans view the situation. That's why you shouldn't help the poor. The reason Black people are not successful because they just don't want it, and that's their role. This is how Republicans see it, right? Then you have more liberals and progressives who understand that, yeah, okay, people are free to some extent, but we still need to have kind of systemic, pressures to put more freedom on it, right? So we kind of extend the freedom with economical aid and so on, right? But in the third stage, you actually realize that freedom was never there from the get-go. And from neurological standpoint, in the beginning, obviously people had no clue. So for instance, Descartes thought that there's like a pineal gland in the brain, and this is where the soul lies. And this is how it is, right? This is how he saw it. Obviously, that's totally false. But then when neurology started to become relevant from 19 to 1950, we already started to understand that different parts of the brain were responsible for different things. So back is for the eye, for the ears, and so on. So we understood that, but we still believed until around 1950s, we actually still believed, okay, we know different parts of the brain are responsible for different types of for different procedures in our bodies, from the eyes here and for eyesight here and so on. But there's still this free ego, this spinal gland that Descartes was talking about, that is located somewhere. We just didn't know where. So at the beginning, from the, let's say, 1930s to 1950s or 1960s, it was just a question, okay, we know different parts are responsible for different things. Now we just need to find that God particle, that main free will soul. And they were searching. They didn't find it. And this is where everything was turned on the head. So in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, Michael Gonzaga made a book, and he was one of the first people who studied the split brain patients, because this was the way you had to cut the corpus callosum, part of the brain, which is responsible for both brain sides to communicate with each other. And they had to do it because people had epileptic seizures, so we had to cut it to cure them. And at the beginning, it seems great, right? Souls seemed to be intact. But once you started to do tests, you actually start to realize that those people had some very hard problems making some very basic tests. And I'm not going to, there are some specific tests they did, but what basically starts to happen is, how do you explain people, for instance, because you have people who you have brain damage or have multiple personality disorders. So for instance, you have a person who wakes up in the morning and wants to put his clothes on, and one hand does it, and the second one hand does not want to. So you have people who can literally take 5 hours to put on their clothes because their wants are constantly changing.
So the thing that makes me curious about this, the thing I want to know is why does this matter? Because I can imagine two different interpretations. In one interpretation, our sense of free will and consciousness and individuality is completely emergent out of brain functions. In another way, I could imagine, the old idea that the brain is a radio, that there's some kind of information pattern that represents who I am and my free will, and my brain is only dialing it in. And if I had some brain injury, then I wouldn't be able to dial in part of it, and you would get effects like that. Now, my question is, don't those things look almost the same? So what difference does it make? Is there a difference?
Well, there's a difference in is what is true, right? Because if you think free will exists and somebody has multiple personality disorder, then he's just pretending he has it, and he doesn't really have it. He's just pretending, because there's no way he can have it. If a person has a brain damage, and he takes 5 hours to put on his clothes because each personality in his brain, because of whatever brain damage, cannot make a decision, there are two ways you can argue. Either is he pretending, or there's no coherent self inside.
Right, but what do you say to a person who says that brain simply can't access that free will under those conditions?
Well,
or it can only access a little bit of it. Like, are we talking about free will as it either exists or doesn't exist, or are we talking about free will as a potential spectrum right?
Right. So again,
you have almost none, but maybe you have a little, and then maybe someone else has a little more, or maybe on a different day when your conditions are correct, maybe you can access more of it or generate more of it. Maybe it's a production.
okay, so
Will.
So let's say you have two murderers, right?
Sure.
One commits a murder and second one decides not to. How do you determine who decided to murder using his free will and who did not? How do we determine which decisions are free and which are not?
I agree very much. I don't think our
I'm asking you to explain.
based on the presumption of free will. Like, I think we should. This is a thing that's in a lot of Nietzsche: is you can't blame people for their actions, but nonetheless, you can still have a justice system, right? You just have to stop thinking about people as individually responsible for their actions in an objective sense. But what do you think? What's your take on the individual's attempt to get more of something that we call will or we call freedom, regardless of what that means? Like, it would look the same if the universe is 100% deterministic, fine. Then what we call free will is always a subset or a description of a completely deterministic universe. But that quality is something that's very important to people and which they might be able to get more of. How do you think they get more of that quality? How do you get a freer will, even in a deterministic universe?
Well, I mean, the problem is that I think a lot of the time it's actually the concept of freedom that can actually potentially even give you less freedom. Yeah.
Like
and it can easily be, let me explain why. Right. So I think the problem is, this is again going back to semantic compatibilism. People can understand that there is a clear difference between viewing yourself as a free being versus you viewing yourself as a consciousness and its content. And the problem is it can go, and now I'm not saying both ways could be dangerous. Like I said before, if you go to somebody who's a drug addict and say, you have no free will, you're determined to be this, now go kill yourself, this is obviously not going to be helpful. But I think you can also help people without ever saying that they have free will. I don't think that free will as a concept doesn't even need to be in a play. Because I can still, if you're a drug addict, let's say, or I am, doesn't matter. Let's say you are, just for sake of argument. I can still say, hey, you can do it, it's in you, I believe in you, without ever saying, hey, you have free will, do what you want. Right? And the problem is, there's also another problem I have. Let's say you're an atheist. But now let's say most of the people are Christian. And I'd say, well, you have freedom to become Christian if you really want to. Or let's say you are gay. And I'm saying, well, you have freedom to become straight. Now you have a huge problem, because now you are in the bubble when you need to pretend. Let's say you have a lot of social pressure. Let's say if somebody, let's say a person, a kid is a gay in a Christian family, right? Well, by Christian definition, he can just freely decide to be straight. So I think that even though it seems on a first glance that freedom of will gives a lot of freedom, it can easily be turned around and actually manipulate people. And this is exactly how neoliberalism does it to, let's say, homeless people, right? So homeless person and jobless person are equal free, but they're both going to sleep under the bridge, right? So we can easily manipulate. Now I'm talking about more political freedom, but obviously the political freedom that liberalism panders to is actually ultimately from the freedom of will, right? So this willing to engage in free market, all that bullshit. And again, it's a very hard subject to say what's the right thing to do for each person. But I think that if we just teach people to understand that, just throw the concept of free will out of the context, there's no free will, but still use pragmatic first and second person language without ever saying free will exists or does not. And we even can teach people that determinism is true, that we just use the first and second person language to easily, more pragmatically communicate. I think that the whole idea of freedom can easily be just thrown out the window. That maybe could be one of the solutions.
So, free will is a combination of two words or two ideas. Yeah. Are they each problematic, or are they only problematic together? Like, freedom is a kind of feeling that people have, and will is a kind of description of some complex function that goes on in at least human beings and maybe everything. So are those things useful independently, and is it only a problem when we think of the freedom and the will as one unit, or are they each problematic in their own right?
Yeah, again, this is the problem with the language games we have and people not understanding that first and second person language is not compatible with their personality. But putting that aside, I think that obviously if we just say will without free, then we usually kind of go to determinism either way, right? Because there's will, you have a will, you have wants, you don't know what you're going to want until that want appears, and you don't know what your next move is going to be until that move or desire appears. And I think the problem is that we conceptualize the idea of free self in our heads so much that we can't see beyond it. Even if you give, like I said, the basic exercise that even Eckhart Tolle did when he was doing his meditations with his students. One technique of stopping yourself from thinking is to try to observe what you're going to think next. So this was one of Eckhart Tolle's ways to make people understand that they are consciousness and so on, a more Buddhist approach. And when you actually engage in that, you actually realize that you don't know what you're going to say or think next until it appears. And the problem is the people have a conceptual understanding that, like I said, that there's like a free soul steering the wheel behind the eyes, something like that. That's totally false. And now the question is, this is the problem of language, right? Because when I say you or I, we usually unintentionally mean free souls behind the eyes doing free decisions, right? And this is the whole way we individualized society with the creation of ego. That I think is because I think there were actually some cultures that the whole idea of self didn't even exist. Like it wasn't in their language game. I think read somewhere something like this. So because we are stuck in the first, second person IU language game, and we take IU seriously as if it's literally true and it's not, I don't see exactly how the solution is unless we start teaching younger generations and just discard the whole freedom out of the window and just talk about first and second person pragmatically without ever invoking that somebody's free. Maybe that would be one solution. I didn't think about solutions too much.
Like a lot of people know that if they're suffering from something and they're trying to deal with it, they're blaming themselves, they're blaming others, that if they just accept the inevitability and the sheer reality of it, that puts them in a better position to actually move forward and feel liberated and not feel burdened and stuck. I think a lot of people could relate to it in that sense. But I'm curious, from your point of view, do you think the word try means anything? Can we try to do things if we have no free will?
Yes, because try still depends on the idea that you are a free person who needs to try something. But I don't believe that maybe I should kind of clarify that. There's in my perspective, there's no such thing as you. You don't exist. It's just we need to clear that from from subjective pragmatic language, like you said, relative subjective pragmatic language, it has nothing to do with nature of this moment. Sure. It obviously there's a difference between trying or do or not try, whatever the case may be. And it's an important tool, right? I can say to you, try to become a better person, try this, try that. Very important. But this is kind of, again, looking at it from a conceptual understanding that you as a free person exists and you don't. You don't know. I can say to you, so I can say, try to do this. But whatever at the end you're going to do is not because you use your free will, right? It's just because for whatever reason, you are determined to do what you're going to do. So that doesn't negate the objective truth about the fact that whatever you're going to do has no freedom in it. Now, here's the punchline. The reason we want to say people have free will is because we know they don't. Because what's the point of, if people actually had free will, literally, like objectively true, wouldn't that be like self-evident and obvious? Why do we need to say, oh, you need to be a good person? Why don't we just go to all psychopaths by this theory and just say, hey, just freely choose to be good people? Why don't we go to drug addicts and just say, hey, just freely choose to stop? And the reason we do that, we try to say you have free will, you are responsible, is exactly because we don't. So this is the first, second person language programming. So our society our society uses the zeitgeist of the language, let's say, lingual metaphysics of the first, second person language is used for pragmatic reasons. But this has nothing to do with the fact that we are all still determined. And my argument is, if we can understand this, then we can create society that I feel is a lot more equal and free and so on. Because even though I agree with your usefulness argument, and I can agree that if you say to somebody, well, you have free will, you can do better, that can, make him feel more free. But at the end of the day, this is just a pragmatic term, but he's still going to be determined to do what he's going to do. Although you're saying to him he's free might also determine to make him a better person. So again, pragmatics is important here. But I
you're
still
determining
think
him by giving him the sense of freedom.
Yeah, but I still feel like we can throw the freedom out of the window and just focus on the fact that there's no free will and just try to create a system where most people can flourish, which I
like this question of like why we tell people that they have free will.
Yeah.
Because it seems like it has a couple of different utilities, right? One is if we have a sort of meta intelligence where we can reshuffle and hack our own brains, that we can sort of steer ourselves a little bit toward focusing on that by being told about freedom. Another way is that all we ever meant by free will is the complexity of causality. But then another way, the more insidious way, is that we attribute free will to people in order to systemically manipulate them, in order to not solve the problems at the level at which they're generated, but to offload those problems onto individuals who don't have
to solve them. Pretty much right at this moment. Yeah, United States.
Obviously, corporations and cities and communities and nations are generating the pollution. And we can go, instead of fixing that, we can ask individuals to recycle their bottles and cans, that sort of thing. Like, we can offload responsibility onto the individual in a way that is designed to preserve the system that's actually causing the problems.
Yeah, well, I mean, but here's the problem. Okay, so there's one thing to use free will in this pragmatic form and obviously, like we argued, you can use it to enslave people, like capitalism is doing. The idea that like poor people just don't choose to be rich, basically, but they could choose to do it. They just don't freely do it, so it's their fault, right? But it's one thing, okay, to use this. So the problem here is that you have people who actually literally believe in free will. So again, quote from Kel Wilber, a heroin addict can just choose to stop. This is a literal quote. He can just freely, out of nowhere, choose to stop. So how can Ken Wilber justify that?
Yeah, that out of nowhere is pretty suspicious. I mean, he might anchor it.
He didn't say out of nowhere, but he literally said he can just choose to stop. And we know that doesn't happen. So why is he pondering that?
Something that, I mean, there are situations in which people seem to be able to just make a choice. Yes. But those situations are determined by the context in which they exist. However, I think a lot of people, I don't necessarily make this argument, but if you believe that there is, an original creation of reality out of nothing, that the laws of the universe could have been different, that there didn't need to be a reality, but there was a complete novelty occurred and which set up these laws of physics in this kind of universe, then people would argue that that complete novelty is still possible, that it could basically intervene in the system at any point. The fact that the entire basis of objective reality was somewhat arbitrary means that that arbitrary element, however strong it is, might still be present and utterly permeating the system, and something that can intervene or tap in or distort situations all the way through reality. How do you feel about that?
I think that, my view is this, for me, because it does seem like, just from our subjective perspective, that we live in a world of cause and effect. Now, this idea that it came out of nothing, nobody knows where it came from. Nobody's saying it came out of nothing, because then obviously you can ask the next question, well, if it came out of nothing, where did the nothing come from? This is the similar problem as where did the God come from, right? The way I see it is, whether you believe in free will or not, even if you did believe in free will, I just don't see how that could work in a causal universe. Because I would assume if somebody has free will, they would need to bend. I just don't see how you could have a free will system that would be not part of a system, right? So if we program somebody, let's say there's a video game, right? At what point would we argue that a character in a video game is now free because he is stuck in the algorithm of the video game itself? right? But there are people in Integral Global who will argue that, well, the video game is actually made out of spirit, and that spirit is like from some weird point of view expressing itself in this freedom or whatever the case may be. However you try to massage this reality, I just don't see how that freedom could be invoked beyond, like you said, the pragmatic point of view as you want to help people on the individual level.
It's very hard to imagine how, even if we said there was an utterly free thing as the backdrop of reality, how would that thing interface with reality, right? On the one hand, how would it interface? I mean, we can imagine it's coming in from the side, but even at the point at which it touches, how would it actually do anything? And that's the same problem about the beginning of the universe. How could there be a beginning? That would be a point at which nothing interacted with something somehow. It seems very philosophically dubious.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that obviously, and there's another problem is that we are extremely limited in terms of how we sense reality. Where, for instance, a snake could sense, obviously, say a snake doesn't have a cognitive capacity to really talk to itself about what it sees and so on. But even if it did, let's say we all sense the world through the eyes of the snake, we might have a completely different meta language and language game if we actually saw reality through the point of view of a snake. But
then beside, true of our intellectual cognition as well, like to what degree,
I assume
what degree do you think that your computations about reality actually apply to reality, and to what degree are they like a limited perceptual apparatus analogous to the snake?
So you're kind of asking me how aware are we of reality? What's your question exactly?
My question is that, like, do we? I mean, yes, our sensory system is limited. Do you think our logical system is equally limited, or do you think our logical system can come across things that are objectively true and not just true from the perception of beings like ourselves?
I think both are extremely limited. I mean, just look at the problem with logic is that logic is made out of language, and language is super limited, right? So, for instance, even like a simple thing like a pen, right? So let's say I have a pen, right? Well, this is just looking at it from a quantum perspective. This is a complex part of many interdependent systems that just work for whatever reason, right? And to say this is a pen is almost like an insult to the complexity that's happening in this little thing here, right? Obviously, for pragmatic reasons, we call it a pen, right? But let's not even talk about a processor, which is even more complex. But just a simple pen is way too complex to comprehend it with words. We just use the words like, oh, it's green, blah, blah, blah. But these are extremely limited. Now, just saying this is a pen is an insult to reality and its complexity. Now, of course, we can go further and say what it's made of. But however deep we go, at some point, language is just not deep enough to really understand it. And it's also extremely limited. Like I said, even the semantic incompatibilism is already deluding us into thinking we are actually free will creatures behind the eyes simply because of the language game.
From the point of view of doing linguistic reasoning, is it possible for us to say that reality is more complicated than our linguistic reasoning can analyze?
I think that
yes, it's too simplistic. It's an insult to reality to say it's a pen, but isn't it also an insult to reality to say that it's more complex than a pen? Isn't that just as limited?
Well, I mean, the problem is, I mean, if you're like trying to say that the word complex itself, I mean, because again, complex could be an insult to complexity because complexity is a lot more complex than a word complex, right? I do feel like that language is extremely limiting. Our senses are limiting. We really have no fucking idea what all this thing is about. We have no fucking clue. That's why we invented gods, spirits. We just have no fucking clue. Now, of course, scientific revolution from the industrial age and a bit more, let's say 1400s, or whenever you want to put it, doesn't matter. Okay, this was when science came along. This was like a new language game that was obviously more accurate. But now with quantum physics and everything, we just have no fucking clue.
What do you mean when you say more accurate? How do we evaluate language games, and what do we evaluate them against?
Well, Yeah, the good question. I mean, it's all about cashing out in this case, right? So let's say 1 + 1 is 2. Obviously, this determined that the reason 1 + 1 is 2 because we all mutually relatively agree that one symbolizes one pen and another one symbolizes the second one, and together they are quote unquote two. And this is so within this relative language game, there are some things that are more true than others. So I can say that 1 + 1 is 2 within this relative language game, but I can't say it's 3, right? Just like I can say that. So if we go back to the pragmatic problem, what would you say to a person who says, let's say he believes that Earth is flat and you know it's round, right? And he says to you, you know what? I need to believe for Earth is flat. This gives me meaning in life. If I realized it was round, that would make me depressed, nihilist. I bet my whole life in the fact that Earth is flat. This is my life's work. Let's say he draw a map that he based on the idea that the Earth is flat. So at which point would you then, because this is, I feel like I'm similar situation when I talk with people who believe in literal free will or people who believe in God, right? At what point do you say Santa Claus doesn't exist? At what point do you say free will doesn't exist, right? So if you had a hypothetical scenario when somebody said, you got to understand, flat earth gives me meaning. If you take away from me, I'm going to fall into depression. What would you say in this case to that person? And you know that earth is round.
It's interesting. I wouldn't necessarily believe them that they would fall into depression, because I think people make statements, right? They don't know. They don't know that they
Right. Okay. But but just hypothetically, let's say he did.
hypothetically.
Yeah, we're talking purely hypothetically.
I mean, I would be diplomatic about it. I think I would try to embrace their viewpoint and the causes of their viewpoint in a way that I thought gave it room to move. I would actually try to get more detail on them, because I think that it would make their view of what they believe more complicated if I asked more nuanced questions. And then I would think that later that might or might not evolve into a richer view of reality.
Yeah,
But I
yeah.
don't think
Yeah,
they
that's
could,
fine.
I don't think they can choose to just switch their viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, a more real example would probably be somebody who believes in God, right? If you were an atheist, let's say, and let's say you're just not, let's say you don't even say that it doesn't exist. Let's just say you're not convinced, right? And now you're arguing to some Christian, well, I want you not to be convinced either. And let's say that Christian really believes that God helped him numerous times. Let's say he survived a car crash, right? Because this is the sort of situation I feel I'm in, not with you, I'm just speaking in general, with people who think free will exists, right? At one point you say, okay, maybe they need to believe it because otherwise they will just fall into nihilism, which I don't think they would. But if hypothetically they did, hypothetically, then yeah, it's extremely important how this language game cashes out, because if somebody, but this kind of brings me to the point of metaphysics of language, right? And this is the going back to the integral problem, right?
I think this pertains in a way to the metaphysics of levels, because one of the interesting things I think is the description of different degrees of complexity of understanding in a relative sense can be based on any view of reality. So the way I would usually handle it is that a person who believed in God should believe in a more sophisticated concept of God than they currently do. That would be a level up. I don't really care whether they describe reality as God exists or God doesn't exist. I would want them to give me more detail about what they mean, so that it forces their mind to be more precise.
Yeah, but we can, right. But here's the problem. Would you argue the same thing for flat earth? Or
Yeah,
which bond?
well, not objectively. Like if I was talking to you about a flat earther,
Yeah.
I would dismiss it as false. But if I was talking to them about their belief, I wouldn't be very interested in trying to persuade them that they're wrong, because I don't think they can be changed by a choice. But I would be interested in trying to get them to clarify more precisely what they mean, because I sort of have a confidence that if we use our brain to clarify what we think more precisely, we start to move to a richer view of what we already think.
Yeah, but what if for instance, somebody believes in a simple idea that a flat is Earth is flat, but you can obviously have a degrees of complexity even just within the flat Earth, right?
Mhm.
So at one point, do you switch from saying, okay, let's just talk about the complexity of the flat Earth, and going from flat to actually going to the round one? Now, again, when it comes to the problem of God, obviously we don't know. I'm agnostic about it. Obviously, there are people in Integral Global who think there's some kind of eros or spirit is in charge. I think that the reason, obviously I can't disprove that, and neither all they have for proof is their subjective experience of God. But then they miss the Wilbur Cohen's letters, which says that the stage the state corresponds with the stage one is in, right? So this is already false, and it's already even false beforehand, because whatever language you use, it's already false. We just don't know what this God or whatever it is. And even we could describe it, we can, because it's too complex. And we said language game is way too. So even if one has a state of oneness, subjectively speaking, that state is not going to tell him anything about how objective or let alone absolute reality works. But what happens, for instance, if you use the integral metaphysics the wrong way, which is something that people usually do in integral global, they will not tackle the issues of objective versus subjective reality, or tackle the issues of semantic incompatibilism, or even tackle the issues of relative language game. They will just say, I'm enlightened and you're not, so you don't know shit, so shut up. This is how it usually goes in integral global. Not to all of them, of course. There are some good people there. But I think that this problem of Wilbur emphasizing upper left language game, and he's obviously trying to encompass the idea that the whole four quadrants are so the main difference is kind of where the quadrants are embedded, right? So if you have a quadrant within a quadrant, let's say these are the quadrants, right? So Wilbur thinks that they are embedded in the upper left part of the screen, and we think they are embedded in lower right. Now, the problem is, usually we associate lower right with materialism and upper left with some kind of a spiritual force, whatever we want to call it, right? Consciousness uses usually. I think that both are actually just kind of our language construct. We don't know, obviously, we don't know how consciousness work on the lower right level, but goddamn, we don't know anything beyond that. And yet you have people in integral global who just totally dismiss the upper right or the lower right quadrant and just say, oh no, it's all spirit. And I just know it because of my state, without knowing that integral already fed this idea into their mind. So when they feel oneness with themselves, it was the train of thought that came. So this is like the problem. If you have a Christian who feels the state of oneness in the meditation, whatever, Jesus was the one who spoke to him. If it's a Muslim, might be Allah. It was, Hindu could be Shiva, Shavi, whatever. So they can understand that whatever comes, whatever state of consciousness you interpret it with, it's just a subjective language game that has nothing to do with objective reality whatsoever. No matter how one you feel. Yeah.
Interpretive subjectivity and the difficulty of knowing what things really are, does that apply equally to sense perceptions, mathematics, machine readouts, all the things we normally think of as the material universe?
Well, I mean, the problem is, what are your claims, and do these claims cash out, right? So I hope I understood the question right, but the problem is that all we have, because of the metaphysics over language and material world as we know it, it does seem like science is the standard. Now, maybe quantum science in the future, and maybe even in the further futures, spirituality will take over, right? But I do feel that at this point, spirituality does not have a solid case for idealism, or at least making claims about absolute reality. But the problem is not just that a lot of people in integral global just assume that it's all spirit. They don't even know the basics of material reality. They actually think that, and this is why I go back to David Long and the problem of emergentism versus idealism. It's not whether or not one is true, because nobody can prove one way or the other because of the language game, because there's no way to prove it. It's absolute. Who knows? And we live in a relative space-time. And no matter what we feel, No amount of feeling oneness with the universe will give us any indication of what absolute reality is, or even relative, right? For instance, you can go to India and talk to some Hindu priest who's been meditating for 50 years. He doesn't know shit about physics. And he will never know shit about physics. So no amount of introspection will tell him anything about physics. And yet those people in Integral Global just pretend that they are already quantum physics experts, just unskillfully tying their spiritual states with, and the reason is because nobody taught them logic, reason, and science. And that's why, and this goes back to the problem why they all think free will exists. Because they were brainwashed into thinking, in a way, maybe not brainwashed, but whatever word you want to use, they need to save that spiritual baby, and they need to tie it with free will, even though it's objectively true, it doesn't exist.
So again, there's this problem of the boundaries between the quadrants are not being clean enough or policed well enough from one zone and attributing it to the other zone. They're
exactly
taking information from personal subjective experience and just
applying it to the upper right. Exactly. Now, we don't use the right method. Now, again, I'm not one of those people who deny spiritual experience. People had spiritual experiences, or we have them, whatever you want to call them. And those could be extremely important and life-changing. When somebody, let's say he prays to the God and he feels love from the God, I'm not denying that that person probably really did, from his subjective point of view, really felt spirit or love through his heart, through his body. None of that is denying. Those are very profound states of consciousness. But at no point should those states make him an expert on quantum physics. And yet you have people who, in Integral Global, again, this is what happens with the neoliberal soulcraft, that you have all the experts about everything. They're experts in everything. And this is the problem. And I feel it creates a very egocentric and scientifically uneducated people. And combining that with free will and neoliberalism, and this is what Integral Global has become, this neoliberal spiritual self-help. And I think that David, when he's tackling the problem with materialism versus idealism, that battle is not going to be won. But free will versus determinism can be won, because the free will does not cash out in idealism. Now again, there are different types of idealism. I had a debate with Erasmus, and I agree that ontologically speaking, everything is happening in consciousness. We can agree with that. But even if that's the case, we still need to be pragmatic materialists, even if he's right. But the problem with Integral Global is they don't have an ability to, first off, understand that each quadrant has its own methodology, and they unskillfully just mishmash the quadrants so they feel superior. And that's why I became kind of disillusioned. And that's why I think that free will is a better way for those people to maybe switch sides. I'm not saying become materialist per se. I'm just saying that to maybe respect science a bit more than they do. So I think gateway to maybe switching sides from idealism to emergentism is maybe through free will, not actually debating which one is true, because we cannot prove either one.
It's a plausible argument. When I think about my own perspective on, let's say, conventional integralism over the last couple of decades, I think it's very clear that there's been an overemphasis on the upper left quadrant. Psychology and spirituality have dominated to some degree. It needs to be rebalanced with both the material and the systemic viewpoint, which are hugely important for people's actual lives and for civilization going forward. I think there's also been a problem of treating content as if the levels consisted of content rather than style, right? To me, like rationality, for example, is a way of processing information. It's not about what information gets processed. Likewise, if you've had a legitimate spiritual experience, that's fine. But when you assert a legitimate spiritual experience, you're being assertive now. You're not being spiritual. So that the levels are defined by the style in which you're behaving, and not by the thing that you think you're talking about. And sometimes people think that the thing they're talking about is so important, and maybe it is. But if they think it's so important it justifies them using a pre-rational form of communication, then they're being pre-rational, not trans-rational. So this mix-up between style and content seems to me a real issue in terms of understanding what the levels really mean. But
Yeah.
I feel like I want to ask you, like, you're very attentive to what we don't know, with the gap between language games and reality, the gap between knowledge and mystery, and between the way we
Yeah,
simplify
I do
reality
think
and what's
we
public.
know
So
very
for
little.
you
Yeah.
personally, what's really real? Like, what makes you feel confident? What's reliable in reality? What's the really real thing as far as you're concerned?
Well, if you the question now, obviously there are kind of two answers I have. So everybody, so since I'm in this case kind of material dialectic, so I believe that all beliefs and values come out of the geographic location and space time of that person. So everything you know, everything you think you are, is a byproduct of the system around you, right? And knowing that fact, for me personally, I think that we need, for people and also for integral global, but just in general, the whole world needs to come to this conclusion that there lives this systemic reality, planet Earth, let's say, that we all live in, right? And if planet Earth does not, I mean, if humanity does not have one coherent picture of what this is and what are the possible solutions, if everybody is just going to claim they're super spiritual beings within the capitalistic system, which is what they're doing, for instance, then nothing's going to get solved, right? So this is why, going back to the beginning point, integralists should not become these new age self-help spiritual gurus. They should become politicians. They should become some people who so for me, integralist is like a parent who's trying to steer the ship. Let's say a parent who might see things from a broader perspective than a child, and he's trying to steer that child to the right direction. But I think it's just like this adult steerer of systems, and not this self-help guru trying to help individual enlightenments. And because the problem is, we need to deal with real material world, and a lot of the time integral global under the Ken Wilber niche, although they're talking about these problems, I'm not denying that, but a lot of the time, some people, again, not all, there are some very good people there, don't get me wrong, but a lot of the time there are just some, spiritual wankers who pretend they're third tier and not engaging in real literal material issues of the world. And this is the problem with Buddhism, because usually Buddhism is just, something that Zizek already pointed out, that you can use Buddhism for different ways, right? I think he said that Heinrich Himmler had a Buddhist text in his pocket in the Second World War, and he was saying and they used Buddhism to kind of justify how you stab, that you can stab a person and you're not really stabbing him because this is just consciousness, nothing is really real. This is just consciousness interacting with other consciousness. There's no such thing as material world, and you can use this Buddhist kind of belief everything is consciousness, doesn't matter, to totally disassociate yourself from the real world. Something that Ken Wilber did when he says you can just feed the children in Africa, or you can just wake up and they'll stop suffering. They will not stop suffering if you wake up. You will maybe stop suffering, but they won't. So even using this upper left Buddhism thing can be very dangerous, because instead of people focusing on the outside material world, in this case material systems, so let's become progressive, let's have Alexandra Cortez, whatever is your political agenda, versus, let's just become a self-help guru and sell some stupid spiritual shit to some idiots who think they want to be enlightened. So that's why I think it could be extremely unhealthy if we don't engage with the material world. And this is kind of my personal purpose, is to switch integral from this circle jerking spiritual idiots to actually switch and come to. I'm not saying that circle jerking spirituality is not. I mean, spirituality is all good. I'm not saying anything against that. I'm just saying that come back to the real world, politics, economics, helping poor people, things like that. So switching integral from this capitalistic neoliberal self-help spiritual bullshit to political movement helping, trying to steer the world to a better place. This is kind of my personal purpose when it comes to these
It
things.
reminds me of, the famous Marxist inversion of Hegel, where we're going to take those developmental processes, but we're going to put the material at the center rather than the ideal. And you're trying
Exactly.
to do that for the integral space.
I mean, I'm actually surprised when I was reading the Phenomenology of Spirit, I'm like 75% through, that even in those times, there was a lot more suffering than is now, right? I mean, this was like 1600s. This was before Marx. This was the beginning of capitalism, right? We didn't even know how capitalism is going to work out back then. And there was a lot of suffering at that time, children working in for 12 hours a day in horrible conditions and so on. And yes, he talked about spirits and so on. And it does seem like he was almost like very disassociated. It really helped him. He felt really good, I assume. But he seemed like very disassociated from the real world. And I think this kind of language game, combining putting priority on the upper left personal experience, can create a very feel-good psychopaths who feel very good from their subjective point of view, but are totally deluded to the suffering of the real world. And this is one danger I feel Integral is also doing, combining that with neoliberal capitalistic thingy, New Age, and so on. So what can happen now? This is kind of my speculation, is that you're going to have in this point in time, you're going to have some people who feel extremely good in capitalism, and some people who feel extremely desperate. So this polarity of extreme goodness from people who live in abundance, who are rich, whatever, for whatever reason, versus extreme bad feelings because people will be put on pressure. Oh, I need to succeed. But obviously in capitalism, the chances of you being a millionaire is almost zero. And you can have a tremendous amount of suffering with some people while having an incredible amount of bliss with others. And those people who have incredible amount of bliss, because they only have their own subjective experience to rely on, will just assume that all those suffering people can just freely choose to be in bliss if they decided to. And this creates what I call a kind of referential fallacy or state fallacy, where you project your good well-being onto other people's while thinking they can just freely do it when they really can't, because you think free will exists. So this is why you have these deluded self-help gurus and teachers and so on, because they actually think that, oh, they just chose to be happy, when in realize it was just determined material conditions. And this is why it's important to see how systems create egos and there's no free will at all, and how neoliberalism creates these egocentric spiritual psychopaths who feel good subjectively but are totally deluded.
So there's this notion you mentioned earlier about the flexibility of Buddhism, right, and the way that it can be used to justify all kinds of different things, as it was during the Second World War. Do you have any similar concerns about materialism and the idea of determined material conditions? Could that potentially be used to justify any situation? And if so, how do we steer ourselves toward the healthy, productive version of a material analysis?
Yeah, that's kind of a morality question, I guess. Yeah, first off, just my quick opinion on morality. Obviously, there's no universal must, right? There's nothing in nature says to us what is right? Should we kill those people or should we not kill those people? Should we have abortion or not? There's nothing you can look at outside world and say, this is the absolute morality. Obviously, Christians do it with Bible and so on, right? But
are you 100% sure of that, or 98% sure of that?
Yeah, I mean, so this is again coming to the metaphysics of cashing out, right? So we know some things about reality. So for instance, let's look at witch burning, right? Why did witch burning exist? Well, witch burning exists because we believed in magic. We believed in they were, I don't know, possessed by Satan, and we just burned them. And we were utterly convinced that we did the right thing and felt good, literally good. We literally felt good burning witches, right? This is where I feel it's very important to have a very realistic point of reality, because you can create somebody who's gonna feel happy burning witches because he felt like justice was being served. She used the free will the wrong way and she deserves her punishment. Just another danger of free will. And so we know material conditions to the extent we know them at this moment in time. Now in the future, morality might change, but my idea is, okay, we can deduct and make some moral claims, not because they're absolute truths, but we can deduct and make some moral claims whether what is right or wrong based on what we know about the material world. And this is the reason why we stopped burning witches. For some real, we some point realized that magic doesn't exist, and we stopped doing that. And so we can use the reality as we know it in the third person language and derive to some moral statements of what can we do, what kind of system can we have to create as least the suffering as possible. I think I kind of go on the same Harry's vein here and just say we can use, let's say, the conscious state as a kind of, so let's say, what can we do to steer towards, everybody's gonna more or less suffer, right, eventually. So the question is, how can we steer the train to least possible suffering, and using science and all what we know about the third person reality, so the third person meta language, to steer that train as best direction as possible, which is what liberalism has been all about. Again, all these systems has been actually, in a way, we could argue, slowly reducing suffering. Now, we're never going to reduce it till the end, unless maybe we understand the world perfectly. But until then, I think I just derive my morals from the best we understand our material conditions and materiality on objective scientific level.
You think the third person language game has the most potential to alleviate suffering?
No, because the problem is we don't know how subjectivity and objectivity are meshed up, right? Because we know that, for instance, I can hurt you from a physical world by punching you, but I can also hurt you from mental world saying mean words to you, like you're a loser, whatever the case may be, right? So I can change your states of consciousness and how you're going to feel either from the external or the internal way, right? Obviously, so if we know both are possible, right, then we need to create language that will be as accurate as possible. And this is, again, trying to understand semantic incompatibilism, in which people need to understand that first and second language is not compatible with third person reality. So it's about constructing the as most accurate language as possible.
What's the appropriate language game to describe, say, psychological and mental experience? Is that inherently described by first person language games? Or like when you describe the processes of someone's mind, does it then fall under a scientific third person language game?
Well, I mean, it depends which quadrant you're looking at. If you're looking at, for instance, spiritual experiences with the fMRI machine, then you're going to use third person language. If you're going to ask somebody how he felt, then he's going to probably use first person language, although he could potentially use third person as well. He could say, the content of this consciousness is coming right in, and content is saying, I felt this way. That would be kind of stupid. Again, first and second person is a lot more pragmatic, because if I want to say I'm going to the store in third person, I can explain that whole day, and the world is too complex to use third person when it comes to engaging with each other on a pragmatic first second person level.
You mentioned Sam Harris and this, the sort of third person notion of a moral landscape and how we can steer toward a better world.
Just one.
I'm curious about your take on like where moral sensibilities are located in beings, because like, did we burn witches because we believed in magic, or did we believe in magic so that we got to burn witches? Like, are we basically good and deluded, or were we aggressive and changed our viewpoint in order to allow ourselves to be cruel?
Well, I mean, again, these are just both probably both at the same time, because we can make such an oversimplification of what is at one or the other. It's a combination of many things that we are not aware of. Right? The fact of the matter is only this moment exists, and whatever we're going to do next moment is completely determined. So this is just a determined universe, and for whatever reason, cognitive capacity is still rising in us, and for whatever reason, cognitive capacity was able to create science or understand science, whatever you want to put it. And once we did that, we stopped burning witches. Now, whether or not it's the left quadrant, right quadrant, it's just all tetra rising in an ever-present moment, in a complexity that's far beyond our language games to comprehend. Now, the quantum physics is trying to get there. we understand a lot more than we ever did. But obviously, just theta rising to each living colon at every moment, and it's just happening this moment forever until I don't know. So there's no. It's just a very complex and impossible to understand nuances of complexity that we can use our language, like the quadrants. So obviously quadrants are trying their best, but it's a very pathetic attempt, but still better than no attempt, right? But pathetic one, but better than no attempt. Yeah.
I'm enjoying this conversation immensely.
Oh, I'm glad you do. Me too. Thanks.
Is there anything else you think we should cover before we finish? Anything else you'd like to talk
Well,
about?
I mean, we can maybe I think all the topics I sent to you on the Facebook, I think we kind of covered. We touched neoliberalism, we touched integral global, we touched capitalism. Maybe we can talk about a bit of the aftermath of the election. It seems like, I don't know, did you watch the news? Is Biden now confirmed winner? Do you know?
I don't know where it is, and I'm not sure whether he's gotten the adequate number of districts or not, or whether it's going to be 2 more weeks before we know the answer. My guess is that he'll probably win.
I hope so too, although I'm afraid what's going to happen. I'm going to probably talk with David Long and David Hartford Jr., I think. We're going to have a specific talk about this election, so I'm not going to say much here. I am happy that Biden won, obviously, because I am pragmatist, even though I don't agree with neoliberal capitalism either way, but I still prefer the lesser of two evil. So I'm a very pragmatic person here. I just hope there's not going to be any huge like civil war. I just hope that, in some time Republicans will be able, because obviously Republicans are interesting people to say the least. Very uneducated and very stupid idiots, just the fact. And they will try to ponder conspiracy theories. They will say QAnon. They will say whatever. And I'm afraid for America. And I hope that we can have a peaceful transition.
Well, if we assume that Biden did win this election, it seems like there's 2 problems. One problem is what are Republicans going to do, both in terms of what the people do, but also in terms of what the administration does with its last couple of months when it has nothing to lose. Mm-hmm. Are they going to pull all the wires out of the machine while they have? I think
they're going to try all the tricks in the book at this point, yeah.
And then the other side is, Biden's not that great. He represents a group of people that essentially structured the system as it is and gave us Donald Trump. So how do we prevent that from self-satisfying? How do we stop them from thinking that they won? How do we force their hand? I think actual progress is much more easy to fight for under a Democratic administration than under a Republican administration. But I don't think a Democratic administration is any good. I think they're essentially the problem, and that in many ways they use Republicans to keep themselves in power by going, look, we're better than those people, right? Do you want the regular version or the corrupt version? Okay, well, I guess I want the regular version, but that argument keeps us in a system that's destroying itself and can't adapt to the accumulating challenges of the moment. So that's really dangerous. I don't know how we deal with that, but I think the fight for progressive values is an easier fight under a Democratic administration.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I think, again, like I said, I'm a very pragmatist here. I agree with everything you're saying. Both sides are corrupt. You just choose, but there's still bad. I mean, even though, I still prefer side that somewhat accepts facts and logic versus some side that doesn't care about reality at all. Right? Because Trump doesn't care.
It makes a difference.
Right-wingers don't care about what's happening.
It makes a difference.
Yeah, it makes a difference.
A person who's not solving your problem and a person who's creating new problems.
Yeah.
That's different.
Yeah. So
bad, but one's better.
Yeah. So I think this is where I see integral 2.0, but just integral global in general, not just 2.0 necessarily. Warriors for progressivism, and not just use integral knowledge to encapsulate it within the neoliberal self-help products, which is what Integral Life is doing within Ken Wilber's shtick. So I think it should be a political movement and educational movement, both sides. And we can use our knowledge to help spread the word of progressivism and so on. And we can also use help progressives, understand these lines and levels and states and times and so on. So they have a more nuanced map of how to navigate the spiral.
So then the question becomes, how do we integrate conservatives?
We don't.
The question of like what, why is Trump being selected for?
Yeah.
Are there actual positives that made people go in that direction? Is there a mood? Is there a spirit of conservative people that progressives need to absorb so that they don't keep losing elections?
So I'm a more revolutionary here. I don't think we should. We need to. This is the problem with integral, right? We want to transcend and include anybody. I think this is bullshit. I think that if people are stupid motherfuckers, they need to be held accountable for being stupid motherfuckers, and they need to change.
What about
we don't have any choice?
Like, if you go to the United States and you say to 150 million people, you're just stupid motherfuckers and we don't need you, they're all still there. They all vote. They all have guns, right? So you can't just dismiss them. You have to find a way to get at least some of them on side.
But think about how they think about the other side. They think these are like neo-Marxists trying to take over the world.
How do you hack that? How do you change?
Well, I mean,
all of them, but enough minds.
No, well, okay. So
get first some of their energy into a progressive movement.
So again, we need to go just be simple pragmatists. So first, obviously, you try to use persuasion, right? The non-aggression principle. And by the way, I think that if somebody thinks anarcho-capitalism, if he believes in that, I think he's a fucking moron. Yeah, just so you know.
Okay.
If he's 15 years old, that's fine. But if he's 60 years and he thinks anarcho-capitalism is a good idea, he's a fucking moron. Okay, but putting that aside,
I think that what, in your view, what makes him a fucking moron? Like what's the kernel of the wrongness of that perspective?
Well, I mean, the problem with liberalism is that they don't understand what liberalism is, right? Because they kind of, let's say they use this idea of freedom, but this is going back to my previous example. Homeless person and an unemployed person are both equally free, but they're gonna both sleep under the bridge, right? They don't understand that you cannot have, because again, liberalism assumes people have free will. So he thinks that all homeless people, he's not probably saying that, but he needs to at some point concede that homeless people just freely choosing to not engage in free market, and therefore they deserve their position.
Is that fundamentally based in the worldview, or is it fundamentally based in an emotional problem? Like, is that person just coming up with ways to not?
He's just.
Or is that just how they view reality?
His worldview is corrupt and stupid. He doesn't know what he's talking about. That's the problem. Right now, again, I can understand why he thinks that, because he was brought up in neoliberal archetype, right? I'm not saying he's dumb, like in any way. I'm just saying that he was. I'm saying that for more emotional response. He was obviously a victim of circumstances, but the problem with anarcho-capitalism is that it's just simply, you can easily deduct what would happen. So if we say anarcho-capitalism is just pure free market, right? At some point, you're going to have a corporation. What's stopping? Let's say we live in a free market capitalism, anarcho without government. What's going to happen is, what would happen if Amazon would be in this situation, right? And it's still spreading. Amazon could hire a private army with no government in charge, obviously, and they could just say, fuck it. Now we are in charge. And who's going to stop them? Now he's going to say, oh, no, non-aggression principle. I mean, this is just virtue signaling, but in capitalism, you cannot have non-aggression principle because you need to coerce somebody in order to get ahead, right? So if I start selling all the T-shirts in your town and monopolize it, then I'm actually coercing you either to be my worker for 8 hours, and obviously it's just going to be a slave labor at that point. And I also coerce other people because now they don't have the freedom to make their own shirts. So again, anarcho-capitalism is.
If the results of the American election came in and the winner was Aljoša, what basic changes would you want to make to the system? What's the minimum set of upgrades that you think are necessary at this point?
Well, if I would probably try to use language of freedom with Republicans. So I would use their language against them. So this idea, so again, we are totally on the same page in this case, right? So let's say we can use freedom in a way we can kind of support a welfare system. We can say, well, homeless people, we need to give them more freedom to choose, and we can do that by giving them universal healthcare, so they can then freely choose to engage in free market economy. Because if we want to be capitalists, you need to have, first you need to live, you need to eat food, you need to have basic needs met. If you don't have that, you're not going to be a capitalist, obviously, because you don't have the resources. So I would say, just to say how I would speak to a Republican, if you want to say how to say poverty, right? As an example, right? I would say, if you want him to be more free, we need to give him some, assets, so he can put himself back on his feet, and then he can create something, a firm or whatever, to compete in the free market. And if you use their ideas of freedom in a way that is also useful within the socialistic democracy way, universal basic freedom, maybe some of them will change their mind and see, oh, I see, yeah, that makes sense. So it's important how you phrase that to them, but that doesn't imply the deny the fact they're still stupid. But you need to be pragmatic. But I'm saying that with you. But if I was talking to them, I wouldn't say that.
Sure.
Yeah. So again, I'm a pragmatist, but I'm not. I still call out people who I think have very stupid positions, right? Because I think that's necessary. I think you need to call people out, not because I'm trying to be mean to that anarcho-capitalist guy, but I'm just saying, look, your ideas are fucking stupid, and I would say that to his face. I think that socialist guy was way unaggressive. Both of you were not. I would pin him down so much he wouldn't. I would be really aggressive with that guy, because he doesn't seem like he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Current popular socialist candidates.
What's your question?
You would be more aggressive than the way socialist candidates have been so far in the United States?
When it comes to dealing with anarcho-capitalists, I would be aggressive, because this is a joke. When it comes to if I would be a president, how would I do this? Yeah, I would definitely try to use, obviously I would use like the Christian language to try to infiltrate some of that socialistic reforms. I wouldn't say social because of the stigma in the United States. One of the things I actually like, and something Marx I think did very well, although Marx never I think said it, but when you say socialism, communism, capitalism, feudalism, usually, let's say if you're a strict capitalist, let's say, and if I say socialism, you're going to have the worst possible ideas of socialism possible. And if I'm a socialist and you say you're a capitalist, I'm going to have all the worst possible capitalistic ideas, right? So I think instead of saying this is capitalism, this is socialism, we just throw all the isms out of the window and just talk about literal material conditions. So idea is, okay, so let's say we ignore capitalism and let's say, okay, we have poor people. So instead of say, let's do socialistic reform, people will freak out, right? But let's say we say, okay, we have poor people, how can we aid them? So maybe we should give them money, maybe we should do this and that program. So we don't need to talk about socialism at all, right? So I think because the problem is in America especially, you have so much stigma around words like capitalism, socialism, that the other side always assumes the worst in the other system, right? And that's why I think it's counterproductive to even use those words and just talk about material conditions in objective language.
Have you been to the United States?
No, I haven't been personally.
Are you concerned that
I talk with a lot of people
from outside the United States might not be giving a correct impression? Like, obviously, there's a situation where media inside the United States totally bullshits the citizens.
Yeah.
But there's also a possibility that like, I know this as a Canadian, there's a tendency for us to be really dismissive of the United States in a way that isn't always fair, just because they look like a spectacle of chaos to us all the time. And I don't know that I'm always treating their points of view fairly enough.
When it comes to these things, there's no such thing as having an objective view. Because again, obviously we are being fed by media, by all the books we read. You can, unless system is extremely simple, it's almost impossible to have an objective view. Everybody's going to have bias by definition. There's no way I can have a pure position, even American. Right. You cannot have a pure position on your situation because the system of America is way too complex. But I actually believe in America a lot. I have a lot of...
Not a pure position, but like in addition to what's going on politically and socioeconomically and metaphysically, there's also what's going on in terms of like the information ecology of how we learn things. Everybody's in a bubble.
Yeah.
One has a pure perspective,
Yeah.
but how do we get a better situation? How do we get a slightly more pure perspective? How do we deal with everything seems to be disinformation? Everything seems to be a cul-de-sac of information.
It's impossible. See, the problem with capitalism versus totalitarianism, and this is something I talked with David when we had, I think we were talking about free will as well with the Ken Wilber podcast. I said that at least the difference between totalitarianism versus capitalism is at least totalitarianism was honest with you in terms of they were saying, look, this is how things are. Now shut the fuck up and go to Gulag. But in capitalism, so in the old times, you kind of control workers by force. You have maybe an army and feudal lord or totalitarian regime, use their, Gestapo police, whatever the case may be, right? Now in capitalism, in order to keep power, you don't do that by force because we live in liberal society. But now you can do it with misinformation. So what corporations need to do now and what they're actually doing is they intentionally have algorithms. Now I'm not saying this is intentionally done because I have other reasons why I think this is the case. But what's happening is because our technology is so advanced, people are now they were never free-willed beings from the get-go. But now they are basically just algorithms, right? You have Cambridge Analytica and all sorts of scandals where you have metadata. I mean, Facebook has a lot of metadata and can really almost control people in a way, right? That's why I have maybe a bit proactive quote that there's no such thing as free market economy. And that's especially true now, because now, even if capitalism goes to the further stages, we can actually control what people want to buy with algorithms in Facebook, right? So it's actually centrally planned economy, because if you can control from the date of birth, this moment, the human now becomes the part of the central planning. So even there, and this is where another thing where this stupid anarcho-capitalism falls apart immediately, because in advanced stages of technological impact, you can literally control what people want to buy. And this is already happening when you have like little girls bombarded with ads of beautiful women, and then they want to be. So this is again the very that movie Cuties. Huge people, take down Netflix, but Cuties is a pure capitalistic creation, because if for whatever reason, it seems like little girls dancing sexually can sell. Why? I mean, it's capitalism creating such a morally problematic circumstances, and I think that we need, again, the only way I see out is for people to understand and comprehend how capitalism's incentive to control the population is having population argue among each other, like QAnon conspiracy theories. Some people think that aliens are controlling, Hillary Clinton is a secret lizard. Some people think that, you have a lot of conspiracy theories and if those people if they argue with each other, corporations can just sell them what they want to hear. That's why you have things like Gaia TV. It's like a spiritual new age thing. And, they tell you, give you their own new age metaphysics of what's happening, right? And it's all, and capitalism is really great at that, because you need to sell what people were pre-programmed to want to believe. So it's actually more, and this is the problem with Corey, that he has an integral global. Even if Corey secretly agreed with me and said there's no free will, he by definition can do it, because he would hurt a lot of his customers base. And this is the problem that capitalism and profit-driven profit is creating. It's better to confirm one's biases using algorithms, and that will obviously create a state of panic, because now people don't know how to deal with literal material conditions, because some people think it's virus is a hoax, some people think aliens are controlling, and this creates a huge chaos. So the only way out I see is people to understand how capitalism is doing that, and once they do, they can outgrow that. But in order to do that, you need to have the basics of logic, systemic thinking, and so on. And it's extremely hard to do. And yeah,
that's what I was going to ask, because if they have to change their understanding and they don't have the free choice to do that, what are the conditions that are necessary to cause their understanding to shift?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, all we have is to educate people. But the problem is capitalism doesn't want to educate because educating people goes against profit, right? It's a lot easier to manipulate stupid people for profit than education. That's why this is something that then I agree with Matthew T. Siegel. I think he did a response video to that anarcho-capitalist and socialist guy. And he said that we need to look, and I agree with him, that we need to look at money and profit in totally different ways, that this should not be the end all be all. It just should be a tools to exchange and not necessarily the end goal, because now we are in profit society, not helping, because we are beyond helping people, right? We are already creating way too many things that would never even need to be created, but we need to do it for the sake of keeping the cyclical consumption going, right? And that has a counter effect. And one is that conspiritual thinking sells well. And if it sells well, there are going to be people who will, people like, what's that guy who was in London Real? That very famous conspiracy theorist, David Icke. I don't know if you know him, right? He's a pure product of capitalism, right? He sells his message on conspiracy. He has a lot of followers, and now he can sell his stupid books, and people think that reptilians are taking over. So capitalism hates reason and logic unless it's used for optimizing profit within the firm. So people will use scientific education. So Cambridge Analytica will use science and reason in terms of how to sell shit to people, but they will sell false information because this is how profit is driven, right? You need, and so it's kind of a weird juxtaposition. Well, capitalism uses science and logic to sell, but in order to sell, people need to be dumb. So this is what I call in my book the difference between the truth value versus sales value. So sales value is usually not true, but it's needed because we need a cyclical economy to go. So we need to money to cycle, right? And if it's in firms' interest to let's say algorithm realize that you're some conspiracy nut. Well, let's say I'm an author who wrote a book. Then you're gonna have a Facebook ad when I'm gonna say, oh, buy my new book about this new conspiracy theory, and you're gonna buy it because it's in my profits narrative to confirm your beliefs that you already have, and I'm just expanding them. And this is why I feel is one of the reasons why we have such a diverse political
problem. How do we break out of that?
Just how we break out of racism, how we break out of everything. It's education and realizing this is going on, but this is going to take a lot of time.
How do we create an educational system or protect our educational system from corruption by the very forces that surround it?
Well, this is, if you want anything to change, you need majority, or you need at least a healthy amount of people who understand what's going on. If you don't have that, nothing's going to change. And this is not just in this time. Throughout history, that was the case. It's just simple material way how revolutions work, right? At some point, if you want French Revolution, you need to have enough people to engage in revolution. The same goes here. Enough people need to be educated. So let's say in this case, you need to have enough progressives in which they will be powerful enough and have enough people behind them to support them, in which then you can change the system. So now we are in the phase of educating that this is happening. And then once we have enough people, there's going to be automatic systemic pressures in which things will change.
Do you think
education is key?
French Revolution were that there was an explosion of education about what was really going on in their society? Or do you think it just happened to be a form of mass irrationality that went against the existing?
Yeah, maybe French Revolution is not the best. I mean, obviously, French Revolution. I mean, there are many reasons, but I'm just kind of saying that material conditions, whatever revolution may be, Bolshevik, whatever, doesn't matter. It's beside the point, right? It doesn't matter which revolution. I'm just saying that in order something to change, there's need to be something bad happening. And then people need to be upset by that. And then they might look for solutions. So for instance, if we now see that the world is diverse, everybody thinks we have conspiracy theorists, we have, QAnon nut jobs and so on. With education, you can see how capitalism is creating those polarities. And once we maybe understand them, we can kind of transcend them. And once we do, we can create a new system where that doesn't happen. But the problem is that material conditions of our time are way too complex for me to say how this is going to go. All I have is just basic pointers that we need people to be educated and see these problems. And once they do, we can change. But when that's going to happen is beyond my comprehension.
I think you would look good with a little mustache, like
I used to have it.
Spanish soap opera star. Just he.
Yeah, I used to have it though. I don't have it this moment. I used to have it. Yeah, I think some of my YouTube pictures. I mean, I do a Facebook picture still have it. Yeah, but thanks.
Well, this is terrific, Aljoša. Thanks for talking to me.
Yeah, no problem. I hope I was clear enough.
Yeah, I hope. We'll leave it to Bruce. He'll have to edit this. I hope we were both coherent.
Well, say hi to Bruce. You know, I know that you probably know that he left our Integral 2.0 group, right?
Yeah.
Because I like Bruce. I think he's a great guy, and I'm just wanted to say to him that I'm sorry it had to happen this way, but I just hope that there's not going to be too much tension between us, and I hope we can still, even if he's not part of the group, still have a mature conversation going, even if we don't agree on some things.
Yeah, I think he needed to pull back a little bit in order to reduce the tension that he felt. But
okay, cool.
I think we're all generally on the same side.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is what I said. I mean, even in Integral Global, most of us there, even though we have some kooky people, are still usually quite progressive, right, and understand the problems of systems. So even though I said a lot of bad things about Integral Global, even in my videos, they are still my political allies, and I still wish them all their best, even if I say they're stupid fucking idiots. And that goes for everybody. Even if I say to that anarcho-capitalist he's a moron, I still think he is. I still wish him the best life. I mean, not he, but his ideas are moronic, to be correct. I still wish him the best life possible. So even if I say fucking moron, doesn't mean I literally mean that I wish him a bad life or anything like that. I'm just saying his ideas are stupid.
You're just saying his ideas are stupid.
Yeah. Okay.